Okay, brilliant. We're going to start now. So good morning. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining us today, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for the next series of webinars, which we're holding in collaboration with CRIPS. CRIPS, business, corporate, and personal legal service providers, and a firm which is specialising in providing practical and commercial advice to businesses and entrepreneurs to assist them in protecting their company through the current lockdown and uncertainty. And the topic of today's seminar is about understanding the government measures available to support your company through COVID-19. And the speaker for today's webinar, we're delighted to be joined by Melanie Stancliffe, who is an employment partner at CRIPS Pemberton Greenish. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Melanie. And just on the subject of questions, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, you can either ask them throughout or also at the end when Melanie's finished speaking, there'll be further time for you to ask any questions you might have. So feel free to hang on until then, if not. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Melanie now.
Well, firstly, let me say muchas gracias. I'm delighted on behalf of CRIPS to be talking to you today. We've been a member of the Chamber a long time, and I suppose today is an example of one of the areas where we want to share some knowledge and help the Chamber's members. I've been practicing employment law in England for 21 years, and I have never seen such an impact on businesses as we are seeing with COVID-19. So not even in the 2008 crash have we had an equivalent situation. The good news is that the UK government is supporting businesses. And today we're going to explore a number of tools open to employers to reduce their costs. It's a constantly changing situation. We've had an extension of the furlough once already, and we've had 5 versions of the government guidance. So just so that you know, the position is as it is today, but it is still evolving. The bad news, of course, for any business is that you may have staff who are affected, and certainly your business will be affected. And if you're a business leader feeling a little under pressure, you are not alone. We're going to give you some examples and tips to help you take confidence that you're availing yourself of all the opportunities you can. So our agenda today is to reduce business staff costs, to use the government's furlough scheme and what you need to do first, but then using the income savings scheme and exploring other benefits and protections. And as Hannah said, if there's time at the end, we can talk questions or perhaps about next steps after the lockdown has eased. So let's move on to our first discussion about reducing employee costs. The first thing to say is this might not always be in your control. If you have staff that are shielding their family members, then they may be taking sick pay for that reason, or they may be affected themselves by the virus. We know that they have a right to statutory sick pay, and it's been confirmed that this is from the first day of isolation. This is the minimum amount that you can pay as a business to your employees. It may be that you have an obligation in their contract to pay full salary. So I'm just moving on to reducing employee costs here, Hannah. Next slide, that's it, lovely. So the statutory sick pay is currently £95 a week, which is considerably less than most employees' salaries. So you will see a cost saving there. It's for employees who are earning over £118 a week, so you know that you will have a discount. And employers are free to switch employees from sick pay to furlough and vice versa, although the government has been at pains to say that we should not abuse furlough to top up small amounts of statutory sick pay. We also have clarification that sick pay can be recovered by smaller businesses for the first 2 weeks. So any smaller businesses on the line, there is an additional benefit for you. We are seeing holiday being used now and in anticipation of the situation after the lockdown ends. Holiday is the employee's annual entitlement to leave, and an employer can require them to use it. The working time regulations, the UK legislation, allows an employer to require an employee to take leave by giving them double the period of notice compared to the period of leave you want them to take. So, for example, if I wanted you to take 1 week's leave, I would give you 2 weeks' notice. 2 days leave, I would give you 4 days' notice, and so on. Using holiday in itself doesn't reduce your costs. Holiday is usually payable at the employee's full salary, and therefore you're not going to make a saving. But what you are doing is encouraging staff, I would imagine, to use their leave now, so that after the lockdown, you will be able to encourage them to do the work that you need and not have a glut of holiday that they haven't used. Using holiday doesn't break furlough leave. We have guidance now that employees can take holiday during that period, and that might help you. You can also ask staff to take unpaid leave. Many contracts will say that employees can be asked to take leave on full pay. Very few will say it is on no pay. So you need to get an employee's agreement not to take leave with pay. And many employees may be prepared to do that, particularly if they are trying to homeschool children and furlough is not appropriate for them. Other option would be to ask staff to take a sabbatical. It may be that some staff have been with you for a long period of time. You have a sabbatical program, you could bring that forward and ask the staff to take the leave now. Going on to the next slide, talking about our employee reductions, we might be thinking about how we can lay off staff. Now, laying off staff in this sense is very specific. The contract has to allow you to do it. And it is very rare for a contract of employment to contain the language you need in order to force staff not to work. If you did have this right, you would be able to reduce your costs quite significantly. The statutory guarantee payment is the amount that you have to pay, which is currently only £30 a week. But this is only available for 5 days or £145 payable in any 3 months. If any of you do have this provision in your contracts, then you would trigger it by sending a letter to the employee and confirming that you are laying them off for a particular period. More useful is the right for the employer to reduce hours and pay. And what we're seeing is that many contracts of employment give some flexibility to employers. Typically, a contract of employment will say, this is the salary, this is the notice period and things like that. And at the end of the contract, it will have a variation clause. It might say, we can make reasonable changes to the terms and conditions of your employment. It may require you to give notice to the employee to make those reasonable changes or to consult with them about it, which means to have a dialogue. So what we're suggesting is that you check, if you haven't already, whether your contract allows you to do that. Given the current circumstances, we anticipate that a reduction in wages or a reduction in hours would be a reasonable change. It's a matter of degree, I suppose. If you're reducing to say 80% hours, 80% pay, that would seem to me to be reasonable, and I would have a conversation with staff members about why. If your contract doesn't allow, then you would still be able to make these reductions if you have informed and consulted with staff. What you're doing is forcing the change through, and you can do that. It does have other consequences, so I'm not advising it in every situation, but where businesses are in a critical need to reduce their costs, you can understand why a conversation with the staff and then making the gesture of saying we're all going to cut our pay by, say, 20% or 50% for a period could be considered reasonable. Most people are making those changes on a temporary basis. Many are aligning themselves to the period for furlough leave, so they're going through until the end of June. Not many people are implementing pay rises at the moment. What we're seeing instead is that any promotions or pay rises are being put on hold. Similarly, bonus payments are being put on hold, and we're seeing recruitment freezes. So let's move on now to look at the situation if it becomes more dire than that. Ultimately, employers might have to consider making redundancies. And I think this section is very relevant not only to the period at the moment, but also looking at the situation when the lockdown ceases. Many employers have found during this period that they have been able to find efficiencies within the business and smarter ways of working, which might reduce the need for certain members of staff. The redundancy definition in law is where you have a reduced need for the work employees do, or where you have closed your business. And in that situation, you can go through and terminate the contracts of employment of employees. There are immediate costs to the business. Some businesses I'm working with will be seeking to defer those costs and delay them, to make payments over a number of months by way of instalments. But ultimately, the business will have to pay statutory redundancy pay, the notice pay agreed with the employee, usually in their contract, and any holiday that the employee has not used. So asking them to use any leave before you make that step is always helpful and will reduce your ultimate costs. There are two procedures which are available when there is a redundancy, and they depend on how many staff you are making redundant. If you are proposing to make redundant 20 or more staff in a period of 90 days, you have to follow a collective redundancy process. This involves informing and consulting with the appointed representatives of the employees over a 45-day period before you make any redundancies. Now, there are challenges about this collective redundancy in the current environment. There may not be representatives already appointed, or the employees' representatives who are appointed may be on furlough leave. So you have to think a little bit creatively about how you're going to do this. If there aren't any representatives, you need to elect them. So you would have to think about how you're going to perform a blind election in this current virtual world. In many cases, the business will not be contemplating 20 or more redundancies, or if it was, it possibly has considered that already. What we're seeing is, at the moment, businesses perhaps contemplating fewer redundancies to achieve the efficiencies that I mentioned. In that situation, they must adopt a fair process, which includes warning the employee at an early stage, consulting with them on an individual basis, selecting them fairly, and considering alternatives to the redundancy. And there are two things to think about in that context. First of all, you need to think, are there any other vacancies available, which there may not be if there's a hiring freeze. And then you need to think about whether you could achieve the objective another way. So if it was purely to cut costs, could you achieve that by changing suppliers or reducing the costs in your business premises? So it's trying to match up the business objective with a fair arrangement with those employees. I'm then going to talk about the UK government's furlough scheme. And I suppose this is the meat of today's talk. Many of you will have already been putting your staff on furlough. So when we talk about the coronavirus job retention scheme, you're possibly already using it. The summary is that that allows you to obtain a grant of up to £2,500 per month per employee. It's available only to businesses. Public sector and grant maintained organisations either often have essential staff who are still working, or the government is not expecting them to apply because they already receive government funds. The aim of the scheme is to retain staff and protect the UK economy. And that makes sense. What it doesn't do is oblige you to retain staff indefinitely. So it is open to you to think during furlough whether a member of staff can be made redundant. I added the last bullet point about the entire grant being paid to the employee because the recent guidance has been very firm on this. There is no possibility for an employer to make a side agreement with the employee and pay them only part of what the employer receives. So let's move on and look at who can apply and when. It's available to any UK organisation. If you have employees and operated a PAYE payroll as at the 28th of February and have a UK bank account. If your organisation has come to the UK more recently, unfortunately they will be ineligible for this scheme. The arrangements for the grant are that you can apply for it for the period from the 1st of March through to the end of June. It was previously until the end of May, so we've had one extension, and it is possible that it will be extended further. We've heard talk today about different organisations who are consulting with the government about the extension after the current leave ends. It is likely that that is not going to be sector specific, but business premises specific, i.e. could you open your business premises? Furlough leave must be taken in minimum periods of 3 weeks. It's available from when your employees stopped work. So if, for example, you closed your store the day after the announcement was made, so on the Tuesday the 24th of March, after the lockdown was announced, you'd be able to claim from Tuesday the 24th of March when the employees ceased working. In practice, what we're seeing is many businesses of a larger size rotating their staff on furlough. This helps them to be fairer to the staff who are going to go down to 80% of their pay, but also ensures that the business is continuing to have people with the right skills for the right pieces of work. We know that a period of furlough leave can include holiday. It can include staff who have been rehired, so they were taken off the books, made redundant or whatever, and they can come back and be furloughed. And some employees are actually asking this of their employers or former employers. Furlough leave can be in parallel with a period of sickness or self-isolating. And it might be that you have employees who have given notice or been given notice, in which case their notice period can be spent on furlough leave. And similarly, employees who are on maternity leave, they can also be furloughed. So to the next slide, what is the support available? Well, for eligible employees who were employed on the 19th of March, they can claim this grant if they are not working. They can be paid up to 80% of their normal earnings. We know that employees come in very many different kinds of arrangements. They could have a flexible working arrangement, working flexible hours. They may have 0 hours contracts. And they may be employees who have been transferred into the business. Now, this was an area of real dispute. Originally, the furlough leave arrangement did not cover transferred staff, but the government has bowed to pressure and said that where there was a transfer of a business after the 28th of February, and there are 2P or PAYE succession rules applying, then those employees will be covered. And the employees eligible are not just British nationals, and they are not just people who are employed in your business. It might be that an employee is employed in their own umbrella business. They might be the owner of that business. They can furlough themselves. Those who are ineligible may also be able to claim universal credit. And I spoke on Radio 5 just after they announced the self-employment scheme, talking a little bit more about universal credit eligibility. The sums that can be claimed are up to £2,500 per month, or 80% of normal earnings, whichever is the lower of those. The claims made by the employer, and then they pass on those sums to the employee involved. It can include the salary and the contractual commission available. It doesn't include any discretionary commissions. So if you have businesses in recruitment or a state agency, you'd want to look very closely at what commission the employees are entitled to, whether it is something you are obliged to pay or whether it's something you have a discretion to pay. Compulsory overtime payments must be included, but other payments, fees, tips, benefits in kind, car allowances, contributions to medical insurances, those are all excluded. So the employer can't claim for them or pay any sums on because they won't receive them. There are specific rules if an employee's salary is not static. If they receive a variable amount of pay, then you have to look back at their earnings for last year in the same month, or the average earnings in 2019-2020 tax year. The positive here is that the government has more recently confirmed that pension contributions on that £2,500 or 80% are also capable of being recouped from the government, and also the employer's national insurance contribution on that £2,500 or 80% are also payable under that grant. So if you get the grant, you will also be able to claim the pension contributions and the employer's social charge as well. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, where we need to think about what you need to do first. One of the points that's been overlooked in many of the guidance has been the position for employees on visas. If you have an employee on a visa, it will possibly have a minimum earning requirement. You have to be careful if you're putting an employee on furlough that they don't go below that minimum level. You also need to inform and consult with your employees, because by putting them on furlough, you are making two changes to their employment. First of all, you're not going to give them any work. Second of all, you're reducing their pay to 80% or £2,500. In that case, you need to talk to them about what you're trying to do, why it's necessary for the business, and to try and seek their agreement to it. Many businesses are missing that step and going right into telling employees or asking employees to agree. And I think that there's a business reason that we've taken that step so quickly or omitted that step altogether. But ultimately, if we don't inform and consult with staff, at least or try to do that, businesses will be in the situation that the employees can claim an award from them for the failure. There is a defence available. There were special circumstances which meant we couldn't inform and consult. But I think that's quite a narrow exception, and I think businesses will be expected to have at least some conversations with staff. So it's always worth doing that. When you write to the affected employees, you're going to be confirming the four things on the slide: that they are going to be furloughed, the dates of the leave, which you might say is initially for 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 9 weeks, but might be extended to give yourself some flexibility, and that they cannot work for you, and that they're accepting a change in their pay. Very few businesses are topping up pay to full 100% levels. Most are going with the 80% equal to the government grant. And do remember here that whilst they can't work for you, the employee can get a second job. So they could, for example, volunteer for the NHS. They could undertake some kind of delivery work, which is also in a boom. or they could be volunteering at a local to them organisation. So there are possibilities for them to be active, but they mustn't be working for you. One of the key things that came out of the Treasury direction last week was the requirement for employees to give written agreement. It was anticipated before that you could give verbal agreement. We now know that that's not the case. And one of the requirements we've seen in the recent guidance is that we have to have a written agreement which we retain for 5 years. So if your organisation had arranged with staff, had confirmed it by email and not received a confirmation back from the employee, I think it's worth doing that step now so that you can evidence that the employee did give written agreement. No organisation is going to have the ability to put written hard copy documents together, but an exchange of emails will certainly be sufficient. So going on to the next slide about how we apply for the grant, we know it's via the HMRC portal, which started work this Monday, just gone. The target for the portal is to provide a payment within 6 working days. And the reason for that slight delay is that they will be looking to make sure that there aren't any spurious or fraudulent claims being made. The intention, stated by Matt Hancock and Rishi Sunak, is that employers who've made those applications on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday will be paid in time to put payroll through on the 30th of April. We know that businesses can claim in advance, and we know that a large number of businesses, £1.3 billion worth of claims were put in on first day, and that did give rise to some initial problems. We know that the website was crashing for some people. The online calculator had to be taken down because it was producing the wrong results. And the main issue was that the portal wasn't allowing for overlapping furlough periods in the same month. So if you had one group of employees that went on furlough, particularly on the 1st, and then another group that went on furlough on the 2nd, you were only able to put one entry through. You couldn't put both entries through. So you have to be a little bit careful where it wasn't allowing furlough staff to be put through for different dates. One needs to submit the claim using the Government Gateway password, ID and password, and completing the online form. Usually it was in batches of 100 employees if you're a larger employer. And you're required to provide evidence of the agreement of staff. What I've yet to hear is that any of our clients have received the payments that they claimed for, but as we're only on the 27th of April, I'm still a little bit early for that. Going on to the next slide, I wanted to just talk through the position for non-employees. Many of you will have a flexible working model where you have perhaps agency staff and contractors, or you might call them consultants, working in your business. And I think one of the things that employers are doing is looking quite carefully about their business needs and to end contracts which may not be absolutely necessary at this time. The arrangements with employees and contractors is that you can, of course, end their contracts more easily than you can end a contract with an employee. So you need to give the notice specified in the contract in writing. Now, we have obviously sometimes worked with people for a long time. Their contractual terms may not have ever been put in writing, or they might have been changed a lot over the years and we might have agreed things verbally. So I think as an example, I would say that if somebody doesn't have a written contract, I would look at giving reasonable notice. And the reasonable notice is usually the period in which you pay them. So if you pay someone weekly, it would be reasonable to start from the position that you give them 1 week's notice. If you pay them monthly, you start from the position you give them 1 month's notice. If the person is genuinely not your employee, then you don't have to follow any procedure to terminate their contract. If they might claim they are an employee, you might want to do so, and just be careful. Agency and contractor staff are not entitled to redundancy pay or to holiday pay. So the only thing that you'd be thinking about is notice. Many businesses who are in professional services will probably have directors or partners, and they are looking at their own office holders, their directors, their partners, to agree either not to take or to take a reduction in their profit share or drawings. We're seeing many businesses where the leaders of the business, the directors in a limited company, for example, would also be looking to take a decrease in their entitlements. We're seeing people take payment holidays and leading by example to, quotes, share the pain, quotes. I think one of the things this does is it fosters positive morale. It's showing that we are in it together. But I think it's also a way of businesses making sure that they live out their values and that they enhance their own business's reputation with the staff that leave, if they ultimately do make redundancies, and the staff that stay. We're seeing business leaders not taking additional bonuses, foregoing bonuses. We're also seeing them not take increases or agreeing that payments due to them can be deferred. And this isn't limited to directors and partners. We're seeing Real Madrid footballers agreeing that they will take a reduction in salary so that the staff who are not playing can be protected. So this is something that's happening across the board, where people are trying to ensure that they are all sharing the pain. I'm going to talk briefly about the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme on the next slide. Originally, the government announced support for businesses and employees only. And what we saw on the 26th of March, on the next slide, that's great, is that we had the government bowing to pressure and protecting the self-employed population. Rishi Sunak announced that taxi drivers and plumbers were not to be left behind and that support was available if the self-employed were suffering traded losses. So there is a grant available to the self-employed person. It's only available for 3 months and it's worth up to 80% of their average monthly income. And bear in mind, it's a taxable grant. So it's a grant that's available but will be taxed. Again, it's up to £2,500 a month, so that sounds familiar to us. The interesting part is who it's available for. It's expected to cover 95% of the self-employed. That's what our Chancellor has said. But we know that it is only available to those with average trading profits from the last 3 years of up to £50,000. So if you are earning from your business, or your business is earning £50,000 or more of trading profit, we know that you're ineligible. And on the day of the announcement, I was on Radio 5 and I talked to many individuals who sadly had fallen through that gap. The scheme is only available to those who submitted a tax return for 2019, so as to minimise fraud. However, those who didn't submit their tax return before 31st January had been given more time to submit it. The difficulty, of course, is for those who've recently gone into business and haven't submitted tax returns, haven't gone through that step yet. If you've had a good year, 1 year, but 2 other years where your income is below £50,000, it might well be that on average you are still entitled to claim. So just to let you know, and apologies for the technical hitches, I'm afraid we've had a few today. The majority of the income must be from self-employment, and this is really quite harsh. It means that those people who had obtained money from property or from other means will not be eligible. It also means that those who had been paying themselves via dividends and not on an employment type arrangement, self-employment arrangement, would also potentially lose out. I'm going to go on to the next slide because although there have been some similarities, there are some key differences from furlough. Furlough arises and an employer, where there is a furlough arrangement, the employees are not to do any work, but a self-employed person can continue to do business. So they are being treated preferentially in that respect. They can continue to perform their normal business function and claim the grant. Perhaps as a counterweight to that, the self-employed person has not had their grant extended yet. HMRC will lead the process with the self-employed. HMRC will notify the self-employed. They will confirm whether they are entitled based on the tax returns that have been submitted. We know that the payments to the self-employed are going to be made after payments to the employees or to the companies to pay to employees. We also know that businesses can claim other payments and support. So I'm going to talk about the packages of support available later, but one of the things specifically for the self-employed is that self-assessment payments have been pushed back from June to January 2021. An individual who is self-employed may also be eligible for universal credit, and you can claim that in addition to the self-employed income support scheme. So how does one apply? Looking at the next slide, you don't. As a self-employed person, HMRC will contact you, and they've identified that or anticipated that they will be able to do so by mid-May. The implications for this are that self-employed businesses will need to take steps in order to cash collect, in order to tide themselves over until mid-May. Payment is due to be made into bank accounts, directly into bank accounts. It's anticipated that they will be one lump sum, and it's likely that those will be paid in June. The scheme, we said originally, was going to be up and running well before the end of June. It's now looking like it will be towards the end of June that we're seeing all these payments being made. But at the moment, the government has kept to the deadlines that it's said in relation to employee claims. So we are hoping that they will do the same for these self-employment schemes. I'm going to talk now in the last stages about other benefits and protections. I'm seeing a lot of businesses who are trying to look at all the opportunities they have to reduce the financial burden on themselves. And I think that there are some things that will be written into contracts and agreements, and some things that we can do even outside of that. Most businesses will have a large cost of rent. So the first thing to be thinking about is whether you can negotiate with your landlord. We are seeing discussions between businesses and their landlords taking a very practical and pragmatic approach that if they defer payments in part or in whole, then the landlord will hopefully have a business to rent to that is still able to carry on as a going concern. We've also had government stepping in and protecting people from eviction. So where previously business property might be forfeit because they haven't paid rent, the government has stepped in and said that for 90 days, a landlord cannot bring the lease to an end by going to court. We're seeing similar notices about residential tenancies, where notices must be given to tenants and wait 3 months to recover the property. So that is good news. Some businesses are getting around that by serving demands, statutory demands, on the businesses in their premises. So it's not foolproof, but it is good news. Suppliers also, it may be that the current virus has really opened up the weaknesses in your supply chain. It might be that you have not received all the supplies that you were looking for, particularly if you're in an organisation that was looking to acquire or had been acquiring PPE. We know that there's significant shortages. So negotiation with suppliers is really, really important. And we've been talking with many businesses here about force majeure and whether that might apply. And I think there are a couple of things to say about force majeure. And I would rate very much the need for you to think about all of your contracts here and whether they've got any of these clauses in them. What they normally do is allow for a situation where there's a natural disaster or a war or a strike. So they don't naturally talk about a pandemic like corona. What we do have, though, is the World Health Organization telling us that the virus outbreak is regarded as a global health emergency. And that might assist businesses to say, well, look, that force majeure clause should apply. Whether you can avoid payment because of the force majeure clause will depend on what the contract says. Sometimes they say a party doesn't have to perform their part of the contract if there is a force majeure event. Sometimes it says it adjusts the arrangements so that there's more time to do the work or more time to pay. And sometimes it just allows a party to end the contract. So it's very much needed to look at the contracts that you have and look at whether you have these clauses and what exactly they say. If you are looking at a situation where you do not have this clause or the clause doesn't apply to the situation, you can still negotiate and look for deferred payments. Or alternatively, ask your supplier for alternative product or services. And it might be that they can achieve what you needed them to provide, but it might need to take longer, or there might need to be a different payment arrangement. We're seeing many businesses claiming under business interruption insurance. I have had cases where insurance companies have paid the sums that were claimed. I've also seen cases where businesses have been left without any remedy, so without any payment from the insurance company. So there is variation on this. What's important is obviously to make sure that whatever the wording of your business interruption insurance, you are providing any evidence to show that that's met. And I know that there are many businesses who are in the course of making these applications. We've talked about some of the areas of financial support available for businesses. Talked about the self-employment scheme and the scheme for employees called furlough. But we're also seeing other arrangements available, business interruption loans, and other loans are being made available. For larger businesses, there's the Bank of England lending facility. We're also seeing business rate holidays, particularly for nurseries, for children, retail, hospitality and leisure businesses. They are seeing some relief from business rates, and the local authority is producing reduced invoices for that. We're also seeing for smaller businesses a grant for businesses that would be entitled to small business rate relief. That grant is £10,000 if the rateable value is under £15,000, or £25,000 if the rateable value of the business property is over £15,000. It's always possible to go beyond that and extend overdrafts. We're seeing lots of businesses who are undertaking loans or obtaining overdrafts, sometimes involving the personal guarantees of leadership teams. There is additional support. So the last few things I want to talk about are the availability for all sectors of more time to pay HMRC. There's been a suspension of debt collection proceedings and cancellation of payments. There's been a deferral of VAT payments for 3 months and an extension for the period of filing accounts at Companies House. So if I take you to the last slide, where I invite your questions, I would draw your attention to our website, Coronavirus Hub, on our website at cripspg.co.uk, or if you Google search CRIPS Coronavirus Hub, there's lots of information there, FAQs, talking about all the issues we've touched on today and more. to give you a good steer, and that's updated regularly to make sure that it is up to date to give you information. So that's enough from me. I'm hoping that by the time we will be through this, by the time we get to see Nadal in the French Open, which has been postponed, because he's one of my favourites. So I know that there are many questions going to be waiting out there. So Hannah, back to you to start the questions off.
Hi, Melanie. Thank you. Hannah is having some difficulties right now with her computer. So thank you so much for your presentation. Anyone that would like to ask a question, please feel free to write it on the Q&A box. And in the meantime, we'll start with, is there any particular bank that you would recommend to apply for the business interruption loans?
No, I mean, I think I would look to your existing bankers, really, because they will know the business well, and they have a self-interest if you're already their banking client, in keeping you as their banking client so that you don't go elsewhere. So I think I would look at your regular bank first.
Okay, thank you. Another question we have is how much notice is required to put someone on furlough?
On furlough?
Yeah.
No notice at all. What you do need is agreement. So if you and I were discussing it today, you were my employee, you said yes, I could put you on furlough from tomorrow morning. The important thing is that you can't work. So today's presentation would mean that you couldn't be on furlough today.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Gonzalo Coelho de Portugal. It says, can you please extend more on the last grant mentioned, or 10K or 25K, depending on the rateable value of business property?
Yes, certainly. The business rate holidays are available. So what we're expecting is that local authorities will be reissuing bills and will write to the businesses who are within the retail, hospitality and leisure sector, or nurseries who are on the Ofsted early years register. So if the rateable value of the property is under £15,000, there will be a grant of £10,000. If the rateable value of the property is over 15,000, so £15,001, then the grant will be £25,000. But this is dealt with by the local authority, not by central government or HMRC.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a couple more. What do I do if an employee is on a maternity leave and I want to put her on furlough?
It's really interesting. I think an employee who is on maternity leave can be put on furlough. You have an obligation not to treat someone less favourably because they're on maternity leave, but you are not obliged to privilege them, to give them priority. So you can turn to the employee and say, I think you'd probably be doing it by emails or by phone, and talk to them and say, look, we need to cut the business cost. We want to put you on furlough. Would you be prepared to agree? I'd probably put the context together of we're having to put everybody else in your team, your department, your floor, whatever it is, on furlough. The arrangement is that you pay the grant will cover 80% of their costs. It might be that for an employee on furlough on maternity leave, you'd have to pay 100% of their costs. So you'd have to top up the extra 20%, but you'd at least be able to claim 80% back. One thing I should stress on that is that we had new guidance yesterday telling us that individuals who are on adoption leave or on parental leave, so not maternity, adoption or parental leave, they would have to be paid 100% of their normal salary on furlough leave. I don't know the reason for that distinction from maternity leave, but that is hot off the presses. So just be careful which leave the employee is taking.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. I apologise for these technical difficulties that we've been having. And then the question we've had, Melanie, is someone has asked, do I still have to deduct an employee's student loan if I put them on furlough?
Yes, you do. The sums that are being paid to the employees are taxable sums. So you normally would put an employee through the payroll, you would deduct tax, deduct employees' national insurance, and it might be that you would put other deductions through. It might be their student loan, it might be a payment that you have to make because you've been ordered by a court to make that deduction and pay it over to their ex-partner or for childcare costs. So you still have to make those deductions, yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, another question that we've had is, I think you mentioned this at the beginning, but a bit more specifically, how long do you reckon that the current scheme of furlough will be around for, and how long employers will continue to be able to apply for it?
I think you'll be able to continue to apply as long as it exists. And at the moment it will exist to the end, the 30th of June. So in its current situation, 30th of June is when the furloughs will end. It is possible it will be extended. It already has been once. And there has been lobbying for it to be extended, perhaps not at the 80% pay rate, but at a lesser pay rate. So, for example, it might be that the government thinks, well, we can't continue to pay everybody 80%, but for those businesses that are public facing or where they could open premises safely and that comply with social distancing, we would not include them, but we would include others in a rolled over furlough scheme. It's also important to remember that employers can agree schemes of their own. So as a business, you might decide that you want to continue to furlough staff. You want them to remain away from work, not undertaking any work and taking a reduced amount of pay. And you could agree that with staff. The downside, of course, is that you are reliant on their agreement. Forcing that through would entitle them to say they've been constructively dismissed. They might claim it's an unfair dismissal. And they might say, well, I'm released from any restrictions like non-competition clauses in my contract. So it is possible that we will see an extension, but if not, I think there will be businesses at the end of the lockdown looking at creative solutions if they can't open or get everybody back to work.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really interesting. Another question we've had from another anonymous member of the audience is, how much notice is an employer required to give one of their employees before they put them on furlough? Is there a legal minimum amount for that?
No, we just touched on that one, Hannah, but I don't think you would have heard it. So it's basically, there's no particular notice required. It's just when the employee stopped work. One thing I could add is that you can go back. So if your organisation had stopped working and sent people home and said, don't do any work from now on, even if you're applying now, but that was a month ago, you can still apply for the furlough payment for that month. So you can, it's a very flexible arrangement. You can claim going backwards. You can also agree going backwards. So if a month ago you went home and we didn't agree it, but now we agree it that it will have started with effect from a month ago, then I can claim that grant in respect of you and paying it over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, I did indeed miss that one before when you
No
answered
problem.
it. Okay. All right. One last question we'd like to ask is, tell us a bit about the kind of companies that Cripps, Pemberton, Greenish typically work with, and if there's been an increase in a certain kind at the moment and how you've been supporting them.
Thank you. We're acting for a lot of businesses in a range of sizes. So they might be owner-managed businesses through to large businesses that would be in the group that would be looking to consult collectively. They may have many hundreds of employees or thousands of employees. A lot of our businesses, I would say, are in financial services, tech, retail, hospitality and travel. So we're seeing lots of businesses who are extremely affected by the virus. And many of them have been talking to us about how they take the strategy forward. They've been putting action plans in place with us, talking about contractually what they're required to do, contractually what they're entitled to do, not only in regard to their employees, but also their suppliers, their other arrangements. And many of them have been thinking about how their business goes forward, because we know that this will end. and we want to have businesses in the best position, as efficient as possible, to go forward. So I think there is a large range in the businesses that we act for, but I think a lot of these themes are very common across the board. And one thing I would say is that there are some businesses that are really walking the walk and showing that they really do care for their employees, and everybody from the top down is in it with them, and taking steps to reduce costs and make the business as efficient and likely to succeed as possible.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good positive note to end on. Well, thank you so much, Melanie, for your time. I'd just like to apologise again to you and to everyone who's joined us for the technical difficulties we've had, but I think we've still got to answer everyone's questions, and there was a lot of very useful information there. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. You can see on the screen now, there's the contact details for getting in touch with Melanie if you want to find out more about anything that she's spoken about in the session today. Her telephone numbers and email. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and to hear about other webinars held by the Spanish Chamber of Commerce over the coming weeks, please just check out our website on the events section. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to your colleague. I didn't catch the name, but thank you both